The October wind cut through the Colorado Territory like a blade, carrying the promise of an early winter that would be merciless to those unprepared. Samuel Hayes pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided his horse along the banks of Clear Creek, the water running dark and cold beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. At 42, Samuel had seen enough harsh seasons to know when nature was preparing to test the resolve of every living soul in its path. The sound reached him before the sitter soft, broken sobbing that seemed to blend with the wind itself. Samuel reined in his horse, listening. There it was again, unmistakably human, unmistakably filled with despair. He dismounted carefully, his weathered boots crunching on the frost-covered grass as he followed the sound downstream. What he found made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. A young woman sat huddled against a large boulder, her thin dress offering little protection against the biting cold. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her shoulders shook with each sob. Scattered around her were the remnants of what had once been belongings: a torn satchel, a broken mirror, a few pieces of clothing that had been trampled into the mud. "Miss," Samuel called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss, are you hurt?" The woman looked up, and Samuel felt his breath catch. Her eyes were the color of summer sky, but they held a pain so deep it seemed to echo his own losses. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features marked by exhaustion and grief. Dirt streaked her cheeks where tears had fallen, and her lips were blue from the cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please don't. I have nothing left to take." Samuel raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to take anything, miss. Name's Samuel Hayes. I've got a small ranch about 5 miles east of here." He gestured toward his horse. "What's your name? What happened here?" The woman's eyes darted to the muddy trail that led away from the river, then back to Samuel, fresh. Tears spilled down her cheeks. They said I was too much trouble, too much of a burden." Her voice cracked. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, my family. They were heading to California, but they said they couldn't afford to keep me anymore." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen many hardships on the frontier, but abandoning family, abandoning a young woman alone in the wilderness, that was a cruelty he couldn't fathom. The temperature was dropping fast, and the clouds overhead promised snow before midnight. "How long have you been here, Margaret?" "Since morning," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "They gave me some food, but I was too upset to eat. Now it's gone." The wind scattered everything. Samuel looked at the darkening sky, then at the shivering woman before him. Every instinct told him to help, though he knew his own supplies were limited. Winter was coming, and his small ranch barely sustained him and the few animals he kept. But looking at Margaret, seeing the hopelessness in her eyes, he knew he couldn't leave her here to die. "Margaret, I can't leave you here. This storm's going to be bad, and the temperature's dropping fast." He untied his bedroll from his saddle. "I've got a cabin. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Margaret shook her head frantically. I don't have anything to offer you. No money, no ... nothing." Samuel was already unrolling his heavy wool blanket, the one that had kept him alive through 3 brutal winters. It was his most precious possession, aside from his horse and rifle. "Right now, Margaret, the only thing that matters is getting you somewhere safe." He draped the blanket around her shoulders, and she immediately pulled it tight, a small whimper of relief escaping her lips. The wool was thick and warm, still holding the heat from Samuel's body. For a moment, Margaret just sat there, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a stranger. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him with those piercing blue eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, memories flickering through his mind, memories of loss, of times when he'd needed help and found none, because everyone deserves a chance, Margaret, and because sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Samuel helped Margaret to her feet. She was weak from hunger and cold, leaning heavily on his arm as they walked toward his horse. The blanket trailed behind her like a cape, and Samuel noticed how small and fragile she seemed wrapped in the thick wool. "Can you ride?" he asked. Margaret nodded, though Samuel could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She tensed at first, then relaxed slightly as she realized he was simply trying to keep her from falling. As they rode toward his cabin, the snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes that quickly covered the ground. Samuel felt Margaret shivering despite the blanket, and he urged his horse faster. Behind them, the river continued its endless flow, carrying away the last traces of where Margaret's family had abandoned her. The cabin peered through the swirling snow like a beacon of hopes, small and weathered, but solid and real. Smoke would soon rise from its chimney, and lamplight would glow warm and yellow in its windows. For the first time since morning, Margaret felt a flicker of something other than despair. As Samuel helped her down from the horse, Margaret clutched the blanket tighter. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Samuel looked at her for a moment, snow gathering on his hat and shoulders. "There's no debt here, Margaret. Sometimes we help each other just because it's the right thing to do." But as they walked toward the cabin door, both of them knew that this moment would change their lives forever. The blizzard was just beginning, and they would need each other to survive what was coming. The cabin was smaller than Margaret had expected, but it radiated warmth that seemed to seep into her bones the moment Samuel opened the door. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers still glowing from the morning's fire. The single room held the basics of frontier life: a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, a narrow bed in the corner, and hooks on the wall for clothing and tools. Samuel immediately went to the fireplace, adding logs and stoking the flames until they danced high and bright. The light flickered across the rough-hewn walls, casting moving shadows that made the small space feel alive and welcoming. "Sit by the fire," Samuel said, pulling one of the wooden chairs closer to the hearth. "You need to get warm before anything else." Margaret settled into the chair, still wrapped in Samuel's blanket. She watched him move around the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking the windows for drafts, filling a kettle with water from a large jug, rummaging through his supplies. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and snow pelted against the windows like thrown sand. "How bad will this storm be?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier now that she was warming up. Samuel paused in his preparations, listening to the wind. "Bad could last 2, maybe 3 days. We're lucky we made it here when we did." He glanced at her, noting how the firelight brought color back to her pale cheeks. "When did you last eat?" Margaret's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she pressed a hand to it in embarrassment. "Yesterday evening, I think. Maybe this morning it's all a blur." Samuel nodded and continued gathering items from his shelves. Margaret watched as he laid out supplies on the table: a small bag of flour, some dried beans, a precious chunk of salt pork, a few shriveled apples from his own trees. It wasn't much, she realized, and a pang of guilt shot through her. "I'm taking your food," she said quietly, "your winter supplies." Samuel looked up from where he was slicing the salt pork. "Margaret, look at me." When she met his eyes, he continued, "I've survived 7 winters in this territory. I know how to stretch supplies, how to hunt when the weather clears, how to make do with less. Right now, you need this food more than I do," he continued, preparing a simple stew, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago learned to take care of himself. Margaret found herself studying his face in the firelight, weathered and lined, but kind. There was something in his eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke of his own hardships endured and overcome. "Samuel," she said hesitantly, "may I ask, do you live here alone?" His hand stilled for a moment, and Margaret saw a shadow cross his features. "I do now," he said quietly. "My wife Ellen passed 3 years ago. Fever took her that winter. We were never blessed with children." Margaret felt her heart constrict. "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have asked." Samuel shook his head, returning to his cooking. "It's all right. Ellen would have wanted me to help you. She had a heart bigger than this whole territory." He smiled slightly, lost in memory. "She used to say that kindness was the only thing that truly mattered in this world. Everything else, money, property, status, none of it means anything if you can't show compassion to another human being." The stew began to simmer, filling the cabin with rich, savory aromas that made Margaret's stomach clench with hunger. Samuel poured water from the kettle into a basin and brought it to her with a clean cloth. "Wash up," he said gently. "You'll feel better." Margaret cleaned the dirt and tears from her face and hands, the warm water feeling like a luxury. When she looked up, Samuel was ladling stew into 2 wooden bowls. He handed her one, along with a spoon carved from horn. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it'll fill you up." Margaret took her first bite and closed her eyes in gratitude. The flavors were simple but hearty: salt pork, beans, and root vegetables in a rich broth. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, not because of its preparation, but because of the kindness with which it was given. They ate in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside their small sanctuary. When Margaret had finished every drop, Samuel offered her more, but she shook her head. "You need to eat, too," she said. "I've already taken so much." Samuel smiled. "There's plenty, Margaret, and you need your strength." As the evening deepened, they sat by the fire, the blanket still wrapped round Margaret's shoulders. The wind continued to howl, and occasionally they could hear the crack of tree branches breaking under the weight of snow. "Tell me about your family," Samuel said gently, "if you want to." Margaret stared into the flames for a long moment. "My parents and I were traveling with my brother and his wife. We'd lost our farm in Missouri drought and debt." Her voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the pain beneath. "The journey was harder than we expected. Food ran low, and my sister Dash, in Dash law, ... She started saying I was eating too much, taking up too much space in the wagon. She convinced my brother that I was a burden they couldn't afford." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "And your parents allowed this?" "My mother cried," Margaret whispered, "but she said they had to think of survival. My father, he wouldn't even look at me when they left me by the river. They said I was young and strong, that I'd find a way, but we all knew." She stopped, unable to finish. "They knew you'd likely die out there, Samuel said, his voice hard with anger. Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. I sat by that river all day, waiting for them to come back. I kept thinking they'd realize their mistake, that they'd turn around. But as the sun started to set, I knew they weren't coming back. Samuel reached over and gently took her hand. Margaret, I want you to listen to me. What they did was wrong. There's no excuse for it, no matter how hard times. You're not a burden. You're a person with value and worth, and you deserve to be treated with dignity. The sincerity in his voice broke something open in Margaret's chest, and she began to cry, not the desperate sobs from earlier, but tears of release, of finally being seen as human by another person. I don't know what I'm going to do, she admitted. I have no skills, no money, no family. I can't even take care of myself. Samuel squeezed her hand gently. Margaret, you survived today. You survived being abandoned, spending hours in the cold, facing the possibility of death, and you're still here. That tells me you're stronger than you think. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the small cabin, something was growing between two lonely souls, not romance, but something deeper and more lasting, mutual understanding, respect, and the beginning of trust. As the night wore on, Samuel gave Margaret his bed and made himself a pallet by the fire. Wrapped in his warm blanket, listening to the storm and the quiet sounds of another person nearby, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Safety, for the first time since her family had abandoned her. She began to believe she might actually survive. Margaret woke to the sound of wood being chopped and the smell of coffee brewing. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small windows, and the howling wind had been replaced by an almost supernatural quiet. She sat up in the narrow bed, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous day came flooding back. Through the window, she could see Samuel outside, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he split logs. The storm had left nearly 2 feet of snow, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. Every tree branch, every fence post, every surface was draped in snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Margaret rose and folded Samuel's blanket carefully, then moved to the window to watch him work. Even at his age, he moved with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to physical labor. Each swing of the axe was precise and economical, splitting the logs cleanly. She noticed he favored his left shoulder slightly, an old injury perhaps, but it didn't slow him down. The cabin door opened, and Samuel stepped inside, carrying an armload of freshly split wood. His cheeks were red from the cold, and snow clung to his dark hair, which was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. "Good morning," he said, setting the wood by the fireplace. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Margaret admitted. "Thank you for giving me your bed. You should have woken me, could have helped with the wood." Samuel shook his head as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "You needed the rest. Besides, I've been doing this alone for 3 years. I'm used to it." He handed her a cup, and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully, savoring the warmth. The storms passed, Samuel continued, settling into the chair across from her. "But the snow's deep. We won't be able to travel for at least a few days, maybe a week, depending on how quickly it melts." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. "I should go. I can't keep imposing on your hospitality." "Where would you go?" Samuel asked gently. "Margaret, you said yourself you have no family, no money. The nearest town is 20 miles south, and even if you made it there, What then? Winter's just beginning. The reality of her situation settled over Margaret like a weight. She had been so focused on surviving each moment that she hadn't truly considered the future. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know." Samuel was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and studying her face. "I have a proposition," he said finally. "Hear me out before you answer." Margaret looked up at him, hope and wariness warring in her expression. "Winter's going to be hard this year," Samuel continued. "I can feel it in my bones. I've got enough supplies for one person, but it'll be tight. However, if there were two people working together, hunting, preserving food, maintaining the cabin, and animals, we'd both have a better chance of making it through." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "You're asking me to stay here with you." "I'm asking you to consider a partnership," Samuel clarified. "You help me with the work, and I'll share what I have. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll help you get to wherever you want to go. I've got a little money saved enough to help. You start fresh somewhere." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motives, but all she saw was the same quiet kindness he'd shown her since finding her by the river. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "What do you get out of it?" Samuel was silent for a long moment, gazing out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "Honestly, I'm tired of being alone. Not in the way you might think," he added quickly. "I'm not looking for romance or companionship in that sense. But living alone, especially out here, it changes a person, makes them hard, suspicious. I can feel myself becoming someone Ellen wouldn't recognize." He looked back at Margaret. "Yesterday, when I helped you, when I gave you my blanket and brought you here, that felt like the first truly good thing I'd done in 3 years. It reminded me of who I used to be." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "And you, trust me. A woman you found abandoned by her own family. I trust what I saw yesterday," Samuel said firmly. "I saw someone who had every reason to give up, to lie down and die, but who kept fighting. I saw someone who was worried about taking my food even though she was starving. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Outside, a hawk circled high overhead, riding the air currents above the snow-covered valley. Margaret watched it for a moment, thinking about survival, about adaptation, about the choices that define a person's life. "What kind of work?" she asked finally. Samuel's face brightened slightly. "Can you cook? Really cook? Not just heat beans in a pot?" Margaret nodded. "My mother taught me. I can make bread, preserve vegetables, prepare meat. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good. There's a vegetable garden that needs to be prepared for spring, chickens to tend, firewood to split and stack. When the weather clears enough, there'll be hunting and trapping, and this cabin, ... He gestured around them. "It needs a woman's touch. Ellen used to make it feel like a home, not just a place to survive." Margaret looked around the sparse cabin, imagining curtains at the windows, perhaps some wildflowers in a jar on the table, the warmth that comes from being truly cared for rather than simply maintained. "I don't want charity," she said quietly. "If I stay, I earn my keep. I won't be a burden." Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Margaret, you wouldn't be a burden. You'd be a partner, and partners look out for each other." Over the course of the morning, as they planned and discussed the arrangement, Margaret began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. Samuel showed her around the cabin, explaining his routines, his methods for conserving supplies, his plans for the winter. She found herself making suggestions, seeing improvements that could be made, ways they could work together more efficiently. By noon, they had shaken hands on their partnership. Margaret would stay through the winter, contributing her labor and skills in exchange for shelter, food, and Samuel's promise to help her start fresh in the spring as they prepared a simple lunch together, working side by side in the small kitchen. Margaret realized that for the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt like she had a future. It might not be the future she had planned, but it was a future nonetheless. Outside, the snow continued to sparkle in the sunlight, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of the creek running beneath its layer of ice. Life, Margaret thought, had a way of surprising you. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen to you turned out to be the beginning of something better. She just had to be brave enough to embrace it. Spring arrived slowly in the Colorado Territory, creeping in with tentative warmth and the gradual retreat of snow from the valley floor. Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Samuel repair the fence around their expanded vegetable garden. The past months had transformed them. Both Margaret had gained weight and strength, her face now healthy and sun-kissed, while Samuel moved with renewed purpose, the haunted look gone from his eyes. Their partnership had evolved naturally through the harsh winter months. Margaret's skills in the kitchen had turned their simple meals into genuine comfort food, while her organizational abilities had brought order and efficiency to every aspect of their daily lives. Samuel, in turn, had taught her to hunt, to read weather patterns, to handle the practical aspects of frontier survival. More importantly, they had become friends, real friends, in a way that transcended convenience or necessity. They talked in the evenings by the fire about books Samuel owned, about Margaret's dreams for the future, about Ellen's memory and the family that had abandoned Margaret. There was no judgment between them, only understanding and mutual respect. "The fence looks good," Margaret called out, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been baking bread, and the yeasty smell drifted from the cabin. Samuel straightened. "Testing the stability of a post should keep the deer out of our vegetables this year. And with the expansion, we'll have enough to trade in town come fall." The mention of town brought a familiar flutter to Margaret's stomach. As spring progressed, the question of her future had become more pressing. True to his word, Samuel had saved money over the winter enough to help her start fresh wherever she chose to go, but the choice itself had become increasingly complicated. "Samuel," she said, walking over to join him by the fence, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." Samuel's hands stilled on the fence post, and Margaret saw something flash across. His face disappointment, maybe, or fear. What about it? Margaret took a breath, gathering her courage. "I know we agreed I'd leave in the spring, and I know you've saved money to help me start over somewhere else." "I have," Samuel said quietly. "The offer stands, Margaret. I'll take you wherever you want to go. What if I don't want to go anywhere?" The words hung between them in the warm spring air. Samuel turned to face her fully, his expression carefully neutral. "What are you saying?" Margaret looked around at the valley, at the cabin that had become home, at the garden they had planned and planted together. "I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere. I'm saying that this partnership we've built, it works. We work well together." Samuel's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "Margaret, I don't want you to feel obligated to stay. You're young, you're beautiful. You could have a real life somewhere else. A husband, children, ... Bull." Margaret smiled at his concern. "Samuel, I appreciate what you're trying to say. but this is a real life. We've built something here together, not just a home, but a true partnership. I've never felt more capable, more valued, more myself than I have these past months." She paused, watching a pair of hawks circle overhead, the same species she'd seen on that first morning. But now they seemed like a sign of continuity rather than uncertainty. "I'm not talking about romance," she continued. "I'm talking about choosing family. You saved my life that night by the river, but more than that, you gave me a chance to discover who I really am. I don't want to leave that behind." Samuel was quiet for a long time, his eyes reflecting a complicated mix of emotions. What would people say? A man and woman living together, unmarried. Margaret laughed, a sound that rang clear and confident. "Across the valley, Samuel. We live 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. The people whose opinions matter, you and me, we know what this is. We know it's built on respect and mutual benefit and genuine caring for each other's welfare." She reached out and took his hand, calloused now from months of shared labor. "Besides, we could make it legal if that would make you more comfortable. A marriage of partnership rather than romance. Ellen would understand, wouldn't she?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears at the mention of his late wife. "She would," he said softly. "Ellen always said that love comes in many forms, and that the important thing was to recognize it and honor it." Over the following weeks, as spring settled fully into summer, they worked out the details of their new arrangement. They would marry. Legally a simple ceremony in town, but continue as partners and friends. They would expand their farming operation, perhaps add some cattle. Margaret talked about starting a small business, making preserves and baked goods to sell in town. The evening before their wedding, they sat on the porch Samuel had built during the winter, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Margaret was mending one of Samuel's shirts, her movements automatic and efficient. Samuel was carving a new handle for their water bucket, wood shavings curling at his feet. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked suddenly. "That night when you found me, do you ever wish you'd just ridden on?" Samuel looked up from his carving, his expression serious. "Never, not once." He set down his knife and looked at her directly. "Margaret, that night changed both our lives. I was dying in this cabin, just existing day to day. You brought life back to this place. You brought purpose back to me." Margaret smiled, continuing her mending. "My family thought they were abandoning me to die. Instead, they set me free to live." As if by mutual agreement, they both looked toward the river, visible through the trees, where Margaret's old life had ended and her new one had begun. The water ran clear and bright in the fading light, carrying away the last traces of winter and bringing the promise of seasons yet to come. The next morning, they rode to town together, Margaret wearing a simple blue dress she had sewn during the winter, Samuel in his best shirt and cleanly shaved. The ceremony was brief and practical, witnessed by the general store owner and his wife, but it felt right to both of them as they rode home as husband and wife partners in the truest sense. Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the woman who had sat crying by the river, abandoned and hopeless, and marveled at how far she had come. That evening, as they settled into their familiar routine of evening chores and quiet conversation, Margaret felt a deep contentment settle over her. She had learned that family wasn't always about blood, that love could grow from kindness and respect, and that sometimes the worst day of your life could be the first day of something beautiful outside their cabin. The hawks called to each other across the valley, and the river continued its eternal flow, carrying away the old and welcoming the new with each passing moment.